John Launer, thank you so much for being here and discussing your work in reflective practice in medicine. Got your book, read through it, and especially focused on the chapter on supervision, which I'd really like to hear, from your perspective, your ideas about that. But first, Ca- can you explain your idea of dumpling soup, which I think really gets to some of the issues in being curious in conversation? So
Yes. Well, it's a great
it's a
pleasure.
great image. Yeah. Can you explain that?
Great pleasure to be here, Tony, and thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this conversation. Um, uh, the idea of dumpling soup really addresses uh, an issue that goes back to the question: how do you apply narrative medicine? How do you apply narrative ideas and skills to actual medical practice and healthcare practice? Because I found from the beginning of being involved in the narrative medicine movement and teaching narrative ideas to working physicians, working health professionals of any kind, that almost the first question that came up was how do you how do you actually deal with the stuff? How do you actually deal with what patients bring? How do you deal with the fact that they're expecting you to be an expert? How do you not only kind of have the theory, but you also have the practice that they expect you to have? And so we found the image that best fitted was the idea of dumpling soup. Now, this isn't exactly how I express it in the book because when I was writing there about a different context, but essentially it's the idea that I'll put this in the clinical context. Uh, a patient comes to you and they have a problem, and the problem is embedded in a story. And if you like, the story is the soup, the story is the fluid bit, and the dumplings are the solid bits of fact, the fact that there is a real physical, actual disease underlying it. And they expect you to deal with the dumplings. Now, what I often say is that if in a conversation with a patient or indeed with a colleague, you only have dumplings, it's indigestible. But if you only have soup, they will inevitably say, where's the nourishment? So that in every clinical encounter, and indeed in every professional encounter, you have to think, is there enough soup here? Are there enough dumplings here? Am I getting the right mixture? Now, if you're seeing with somebody with peritonitis, for example, it's going to have to be all dumplings. You don't have the luxury to swim around in the soup. But we see so many things that are not peritonitis. We see so many things that are multi-layered, complex, contextualized, have all kinds of dimensions to them. And if we just go for the dumplings, for example, just trying to get a diagnosis and nothing else, we won't get very far. That I just add one other thing, which is it's a wonderfully international metaphor. I haven't visited a single country anywhere in the world that doesn't have their version of dumpling soup, whether it's sort of wonton soup in Beijing or, you know, knedlach in Jewish communities or in Israel. Always somewhere you will find people have their dumpling soup.
Yeah, the one thing I love about the idea or the image of soup and narrative is that it's fluid. And how we tell stories about ourselves, how we represent ourselves, highly variable by context, by who we're talking with, who's talking to us, who they are, and so forth. So I really love that idea of the fluidity of the narrative, which I think your practice tries to get to, if I understand it. Being
Yes.
curious. Yeah.
Yes. Well, we one of our axioms is uh, every narrative has its own momentum,
Right.
and all you need to do, ideally, is not to block that momentum. The other axiom we have is every narrative has the possibility of going where it needs to go, which isn't necessarily anywhere you're expecting as the professional, or anywhere the narrator is expecting as the person who's bringing the problem or the issue or the dilemma, there's a wonderful kind of fluid dynamic
Mhm.
within narratives themselves that create new realities as you have the conversation.
Yeah, I'm curious about where this came from, where your ideas of supervision came from. What was your experience as a junior doctor under supervision? Did that did that change your notion of what's possible?
Well, as a junior doctor, I had very conventional supervision, which is to say, my teacher's ideas of supervision was telling me what to do,
Right.
telling me the facts, correcting me when I got things wrong, giving me advice and guidance. It wasn't in any sense what I would now recognize as interactional or conversational. I then entered family medicine, worked as a GP, where essentially supervision was very, very informal and opportunistic. You might just, have a corridor conversation with one of your colleagues unless you worked as a sole practitioner. But I then trained as a family therapist. And in addition to being a family physician, and I discovered how seriously family therapists took supervision. We would have maybe a half an hour conversation before seeing a family where we looked at the referral and thought about hypotheses of what might be going on here. We then had breaks during the session itself. To discuss what was going on, and then we debriefed after the session. So they took supervision tremendously seriously. And I started to think a lot, I mean, not just on my own, but with one of my tutors who was herself a child psychiatrist. I started to think very deeply about how could we translate some of this in a way that was useful for general practice, for medicine generally, for the health professions generally, where supervision was very, very sparse indeed. And it led to two things, I think. One is realizing that supervision inevitably has two meanings. One meaning is the looking over your shoulder to make sure you're getting things right and not killing the patient. And the other is what I call supervision, which is something you actually want, which is something that is very nourishing. And the other thing, I suppose, was that we realized that we couldn't in a million years expect doctors and health professionals to indulge in the kind of supervision that family therapists have. It simply wasn't an achievable luxury. What we could do was to introduce some trainings and some techniques that would allow people to have what you might call systemic or narrative style supervision in very short spaces of time, in 5 minutes, in 3 minutes, I mean, in half a minute if necessary, that we would have a set of principles for doing as much supervision as it was possible to do, as well as it was possible to do, in however little time was available.
Can you give an example of maybe a recent encounter you've had with someone where you provided supervision? I love that idea of breaking that up
Gosh,
into
I'll have to
something that's
think.
more exploratory. Yeah.
Yes, I'll have to think very rapidly on my feet. I'm doing demonstration supervisions all the time, by which I mean I'm uh, working with a group where I will ask, well, has somebody got a case to bring where we can talk it through? And I can ask you a very few questions um, and try and help you focus without providing any solutions, without providing any answers. I can focus the conversation in such a way that I think it will give your narrative a chance to expand. Now, I'm saying this as I play for time, trying to think of a specific example, but I'll give you a typical one and hope to think of a specific one later. A typical one would be to say what's essential for me to know about your dilemma, and if given that we've got 5 minutes, what's the most important thing you would like to achieve in that 5 minutes?
Hmm.
And uh, then the next question might be, what do I need to know about your working context to make sense of how this dilemma has arisen? What do I need to know about the other participants? So I'd ask, in a sense, questions that are very much derived from family therapy
Yeah.
and but used in a very short space of time. And at the end of that 5 minutes, I might say, so we've only had 5 minutes. Uh, has it helped you get anywhere near where you were hoping? And very often you will get a response like, um, actually, I didn't really know what I thought until I heard myself say it. I mean, as you're going along, you might get responses like, that's a very interesting question, or that's just made me remember something, because of course there's an unlocking quality about these questions that helps people recall information that is relevant that was kind of blocked previously, but the questions have freed them up. And then in the end they'll say, yeah, actually, I think I knew all along what to do, but having this conversation has kind of affirmed it in my mind, or it's made me decide actually to do something entirely different. Now, I'm giving a generic description here rather than the precise one you asked for, but these are processes that we observe, I mean, literally every day when we use conversations of writing change.
Yeah, and so I think what you do, which is something I can really relate to debriefing Jenny Rudolph's work, the people from the Harvard Simulation Center that really emphasize not giving feedback, not jumping directly to you did this, you need to do it
Yeah,
differently, but I really want to understand what your thought process was. Why did you why did you make that mistake? And or why did you do this or that? And
exactly,
being really curious and because
exactly.
you may learn something and change your mind. And so you have to be open.
Exactly. We're entirely based on the principle of curiosity, which we've taken from the great Milan school of family therapy, and particularly from Gianfranco Cecchini, who wrote a paper just called Curiosity. But we shock people in many ways, and this sounds similar to the work that Jenny Rudolph does. One is that we counsel to avoid reflecting back. We don't generally say, so what you're telling me is, because we regard that as what we call colonizing the narrative. Because however well you paraphrase it, you're inevitably using your own words and you're slowing down the momentum of the conversation. And the other thing we counsel even more strongly against is reframing in terms of it sounds to me as if, or I wonder if what is really going on here. And again, it's a way of substituting your narrative for the other person's narrative rather than having the faith that their narrative will have its own energy. It doesn't need you to reinterpret it in order to go where it needs to go.
So does your questions then come from what you're hearing, and that leads to another question and then another question? Is that the idea without reframing it, or as you're saying, colonizing the narrative? You
Yeah.
just get them talking and reflecting. Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
we get people to do the same exercise over and over and over again. And the exercise, it involves applying what we call the three golden rules. Now, the first rule is only ask questions, short, simple, open ones. The second rule is make sure that every question follows on from something that has already appeared in the narrative. So you don't have a set litany of questions of the kind that especially doctors are taught, which you've got prepared in advance, like planes waiting to take off at JFK Airport, and they're already stacked up in advance. And the third rule is just withhold advice, interpretations, reframing, all those things that I've mentioned. Now, we do that exercise over and over and over again. Firstly, because it introduces the discipline of narrative inquiry. Secondly, because it makes people very aware of their own automatic habits. And we get so many people who say, oh, these rules are so easy to follow. I do them all the time. And then they try them for 3 minutes and they suddenly have to stop themselves doing things which they've always assumed they could do. And actually, they're beginning to question, well, is it right to do them? Do I do them because they help this particular person at this particular time? Or am I doing them because somehow I've been indoctrinated with the idea that they're good technique? Now, having said all of that, I would want to add those three rules are not the whole of conversations inviting change. They're not the whole of narrative inquiry. They're a discipline to inculcate it, but obviously, when people then practice it, they have to integrate what we call the dumplings. They have to integrate the normative bits. They have to be able to say, look, I'm going to have to pause this inquiry for a little to share an anxiety I have that there may be a legal issue here, or there may be a patient safety issue here. I mean, if you're hearing a narrative of, let's say, domestic abuse, you
Hmm.
can't go on and on and on just asking narrative inquiry questions. You, particularly to somebody junior, you may have to say, look, are you aware of the statutory requirements here about reporting and escalating? So you have to keep your expert professional hat on at the same time as keeping the narrative inquiry going.
Yeah, that's right. You have to exercise some judgment in where this goes, and that's different than being judgmental.
Absolutely.
So there's really a difference there. I'm wondering, and I wanted to talk with you about your idea of your practice of peer supervision. But first, I just wonder, do the people under supervision then are they able to then practice that on their own? There's this notion of reflection on action, which I
Yes.
think, and then reflection in action. Having the experience, for example, in your supervision model of uh, hearing themselves answer their own
Yeah.
questions and hearing the questions that you're asking. Are they able to do that on their own? Do you find that they're then able to provide some self-supervision and monitor their own thought processes and look at their questions in the same way that you did?
I think it's an excellent question, and as you ask it, I reflect there are probably three kinds of people, very, very broadly speaking. This is a very kind of ad hoc categorization. I think number one is people we come across who seem to do this intuitively, and they maybe come to one workshop and we watch them and we're amazed because we can't quite believe they've never done this training before because it fits so well with their own innate curiosity that they just carry on doing it. There's uh, another level where people are already perhaps very experienced counselors or coaches or mentors, and they come along to our courses, and in a way, they use it as a kind of corrective. So they say, yeah, I think what I've been doing up till now is pretty good, but this will help me be even better. So I will drop some of my automatisms. I will drop some of the kind of more, what I would call the more performative, touchy feely stuff that a lot of people are taught.
Mm,
And so they improve. And then I think there's a third level, and they're often people who come onto our trainers courses. We run trainers courses that actually last a year. People come to a fortnightly 3 hour session uh, for a year. They submit a video for uh, assessment, they submit a written portfolio, and they become trainers of CIC. And I would guess they are our champions or our enthusiasts. And I think they are capable of using this at a very sophisticated level. So they might be willing to take on supervision of in very, very complex circumstances, maybe dealing with a lot of psychological trauma, or maybe dealing with complex organizational, institutional conflict, that kind of thing. We wouldn't expect somebody, even very intuitive, who'd come to a single workshop or even, let's say, a 3 day course to go into those kinds of environments and function well. But we would expect somebody at the end of a year's course, for example, to be able to offer narrative style consultancy to their organization or similar kinds of work. Does that answer your question? Quite an elaborate answer to a simple question.
Uh, I think it does to some degree. Yeah, again, I'm just really curious. Are people able to practice this on their own? Like, for example, if you're working with a clinician and you're asking curious questions to try to get them to hear their own thought process, are they able to do that on their own? Does your process help them to do what you do, but they do it on their own because you can't be there. The supervisor can't be there always. Um,
I
can they
think
reflect in action during?
I think that the answer is there's a whole spectrum.
Yeah,
There are people I can do a one-off supervision with who think that was helpful, but they won't necessarily have noticed what I was doing or understood what I was doing.
yeah, yeah,
And at the other end, you get people who have an epiphany. And I meet people literally years later. Now, this sounds as full of vanity as it's possible to sound, but I do meet people 10 years later who say, I had a conversation with you 10 years ago, and it completely changed the way that I think and completely changed the way I supervise. Now, to make that sound slightly less vain, they don't just say it to me. They might say it to any one of our
yeah,
CIC trainers. That somehow a light has gone on through a single conversation or a series of conversations. They think I think differently now. I have a conversation with myself now that is
yeah,
similar to the conversation that you had with me 10 years ago.
yeah. That's exactly what I'm wondering. Do they have a similar conversation? And after 10 years, yeah, what did they get out of it? What were the outcomes for them personally? And so that's exactly, I think, the idea that I'm
Yeah.
wondering about. Um, can you incorporate this so that you don't have a supervisor, because who has that luxury to have that? And supervision has such a negative connotation often.
Yes.
There's first the assumption that you get a medical degree or you're an expert clinician, therefore you can provide supervision. I'm just really appalled that medical education has no, what I've seen in the US anyway, has no training in being a preceptor, in doing something, whether it's your process or some debriefing approach. I think that you've really kind of changed you've kind of reframed the whole conversation around what supervision is by calling it supervision. It's not hierarchical.
Yeah.
It's not didactic. It's inquisitive. It's innately curious. Um, and also the other thing that is I really can relate to in your approach is that you are both teacher and learner. When you're a supervisor, you're learning
Yeah.
from whoever you're working with, which is so important for med students.
Yes.
If you don't have any clinical experience, um, your patients become your teachers in many ways.
Yes. I just like to interpolate a couple of comments here. Number one is I think the situation is better in the UK than it is in the US with regard to supervision within the medical professions, the health professions generally. It's not ideal, but I think it is better and I think it is improving. I'd also like to get back for a moment to the issue of self supervision, which also relates to seeing patients and what some patients are capable of doing. That sometimes we have a conversation with somebody and we realize they are self supervising as we speak. And then what we counsel people to do is absolute minimalism. So sometimes we will see somebody trying to learn the techniques of CIC and they're asking lots and lots of questions. And what we're noticing is actually it's not helping because the person is reflecting and supervising themselves as they speak. A patient may be doing this as well.
Yeah.
So what we say is hold back. They're actually doing CIC through inner dialogue, internal dialogue.
Right.
and the less you say, the better.
Yeah. Um, with I just lost my next question. Oh, um, I'm really interested in this idea also of peer supervision. How does that work? Because that really, in many ways, it flattens the hierarchy. So can you
Yes.
explain a little bit about that, how that works?
Well, it comes from a model that's used in many of the mental health professions, particularly in psychotherapy and counseling, to
Mhm.
some extent in social work as well, where people wouldn't dream of engaging with complex casework without regularly touching base with somebody probably of the same level of experience as them, saying, can we have regular conversations about our work and particularly the most challenging parts of our work? Now, we've tried to introduce that right across the health profession, so encouraging people to say, um, it, it's amazing, given the complexity and the challenges of the work that we do, that we don't organize this for ourselves, and we think everyone should. In some countries, Denmark, for example, it's becoming mandatory for family physicians, for example. There are other countries across the world that are thinking of introducing it in one form or another. Uh, it often gets mixed up with assessment or evaluation, but ideally, in most circumstances, it's best just to have a completely neutral and confidential space where two equal practitioners can meet and either one supervise the other or take it in turns for mutual peer supervision.
Is your model practice in different? Oops, there's some feedback, I think. I'm just curious, is your model practiced in different countries?
Oh,
Have
yes.
countries adopted your approach and has it changed the culture of training and supervision?
Yes. There are two countries where it's had a particular impact. You may be quite surprised. One isn't surprising. It's had quite an impact in Ireland, where a number of practitioners now are developing. They are. We have two CIC trainers there, and they're developing this among their peers in Ireland. And the other place is Japan. That we've had Japanese family physicians in particular take an interest in in the model, and they're now developing their own forms of dissemination, of spreading it among their learners, among their established practitioners. One of the organizations we've worked with quite closely is the Japanese Primary Care Association. But I've recently come back from Beijing, where I was working with the School of Health Humanities at what they still call Peking University. They're very interested in taking up there. There are many other countries where we've had we've gone and taught courses, and then people have gone and run with the idea and developed it in their own ways. Uh, Scandinavia, including Finland and Norway, especially, uh, Israel, um, uh, different places around the world.
Do you know why people adopt? What was their motivation or what was the need that your model addresses in their healthcare system?
Uh, Number one is dissatisfaction with doctors and health professionals.
Right.
How can we have more empathic conversations which are less likely to lead to complaints and litigation? Uh,
Yeah.
Number two, how can we free ourselves from the burden of feeling we have to fix everything? That every person who walks through the door, I have to be the rescuer. Uh, can we develop a mode of practice that allows me just to empower people to address their own issues? Uh, and I think those are the two drivers of interest in what we do.
Yeah, what really appeals to me again about your model is perhaps abandoning the need to be correct, to be certain. A lot of
Yeah,
medical education is based on certainty. Um, you know, clinicians sometimes just being unable to admit that they're stuck or that things are ambiguous or they just can't figure things out. And so, they stick with the dumplings.
Yes.
They stick with the facts. In the American system, one of the burdens is the business model
Yes.
of how we operate, which is based upon efficiency, seeing more and more patients. My daughter's a physician. She talks about this, the pressure to
Yeah.
keep performing. And the better you are, the more you're expected to perform. So I look forward to a revolution here on this notion of taking time, even in a minute or two. I love that idea that it doesn't take. It's not like supervision and psychotherapy. They can go
Yeah.
on for
Exactly.
some time and on a regular
Yeah.
basis. Getting, just asking those curious questions and opening people up. There's one final area I want to talk about, and we could keep talking about this issue, is there a need for standards of practice in how we practice narrative-based medicine or narrative medicine? Do you see a need for us to start looking at what are the minimal standards of practice? What's the minimal training that someone would need to go through? What's the content of the curriculum to develop
Yeah.
people? What are your thoughts about the standards?
Well, I'd make a distinction between what I call academic narrative medicine, as taught, for example, at Columbia, where I know they're interested in developing standards for teachers of narrative medicine. That if you want to go out there and say, I am teaching narrative medicine in the manner of Columbia University, quite legitimately, they will need to set standards for what qualifies you to do that, and what standards you should meet when doing it. I think that's entirely different from the standards that we should set and indeed do set for narrative practice. And for conversational writing change, for our trainers, we have an accreditation system
Right.
where they must, as I say, go through uh, a standard training, which takes, as I said, fortnightly for a year. There is a handbook, there's a curriculum, there's a set of standards in there regarding what they are expected to meet, and there's an evaluation system. And we pretty much insist that nobody calls themselves an accredited trainer of CIC without having passed those standards. Now, I think that's unique for CIC. Whether there are other forms of narrative practice, one might extrapolate that. I don't know, but at least we've made a start in that area. But it's very different from a theoretical examination. We do say to people that when they have been on one of our courses, they can represent themselves as a CIC practitioner without any evaluation. But we make clear that that is not the same as being an accredited trainer. It's not a claim to having passed any particular standard. So we have a different bar for calling yourself a practitioner and being an accredited trainer.
Do you think it's possible to create a universal framework for good supervision, or is it entirely contextual, depending upon the practice, the location, um, the
I need
situation?
to think very hard about that. Uh, I think the variety of contexts in which supervision takes place is so wide that
Mm.
it's hard to imagine what standards might be. Although I think one could take a particular institution, let's say a large HMO, and introduce standards that were applicable within that organization. One could introduce standards within a particular profession. In fact, I'm sure there are standards for something like, well, I guess there are standards for something like the American Psychological Association of what their standards would be for supervision. I think universal's a very big word, and I'd be skeptical about uh, trying to introduce something that wasn't so didn't end up being so vague and dilute because it needed to cover so many professions, so many contexts that actually it ended up being very hard to apply. I don't know. That's just my gut reaction. What do you think?
Well, I think that um, what would be universal for me if, for example, just at least mentioning some of the components of learning, a curriculum with a theoretical background, practice, supervision, assessment of skills, those sorts of things can
Yes.
be applied to many different settings.
Yes.
Narrative medicine or narrative-based practice in emergency medicine might look quite different than if it was practiced in psychiatry or family care. But the idea of having some practice and observations and supervision, those uh, general categories, understanding that each one of the curriculum could be different, the practice could be different, the supervision
Yeah.
model could be different, and the assessment could look different. But I think that it is possible to at least lay out some of the general
Yes.
headings of what supervision could look
Yes.
like, understanding that it would be different in different contexts.
Yes. I'd call that a framework rather
The
than
framework,
a
yeah.
set of standards, but I do agree. Do I have time before we finish for a quick advertisement?
Please.
We have a website which is www.conversationsinvitingchange.com. And as we've been speaking, I've also remembered that on that website you will find actually a video example of one of these very short consultations. It actually only lasts 7 minutes with a patient who has persistent pain. She's actually an actor, but she herself has had lived experience of persistent pain, so she acts extremely well. It's a blog piece, and it's called "Why Listening to a Story is Better Than Taking a History." And if you look at that blog piece on our Conversations Inviting Change website, you'll see an example of exactly the kind of short conversation that you asked me about earlier.
Well, I'm definitely going to look at that and then include that website into our blog as well
Thank
to
you.
alert people to what you're doing. One final question, because you just mentioned I think a patient actor, and
Yes.
is there a place for and my area is simulation training and
Yeah.
assessment of skills. Is there a place for simulations in conversations, inviting change supervision?
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely.
possible? Yeah,
Yes, absolutely. We generally do it through, we generally train through live peer supervision, through people bringing cases to supervise mutually. We, on the whole, don't use role play, although we occasionally do. Uh, we haven't used simulation, but in principle, I think it would be a very useful venture to try out.
well, I'd love to be a part of that
Look forward
adventure
to it.
if that's possible. Love to spend some time in London with you.
Well, please do come over.
I will. John, thank you so much for this conversation, and I hope we can continue it.
I
And
hope so too. It really has been a pleasure.
it's been a great pleasure for me. Thanks so much again.